The state of Nebraska ranks first in commercial meat production. It ranks first in cattle slaughter, second in cattle and calves, and second in cattle on feed. It ranks seventh in commercial hog slaughter, but doesn't break the top 20 in milk production. While Nebraska's livestock industry still makes up a good share of total agricultural production, it's not nearly as valuable as it once was. And that impacts the other side of ag, corn and soybean production. At last week's Soybean Management Field Day in Waterloo, Bruce Johnson talked with us about Nebraska's so-called Golden Triangle, the symbiotic relationship between Nebraska's livestock and its crops.
Well, livestock has always been important in the state, and probably a decade ago, when we looked at the value of ag output, that maybe 60% or more of the ag output would be livestock versus crops. What's happened in the last few years is that now livestock might be probably 35 to 40% of our total agricultural output. So it's been a switch in terms of emphasis.
What all plays into that?
Mainly in the last decade, we've ramped up crop production amazingly well. And to be honest, higher commodity prices too, which raise the value of that. At the same time, that higher commodity price leads to higher feed input costs, and so the livestock industry was growing at a much smaller rate.
So is that something to be concerned about?
It is. What we're getting at with this idea of a golden triangle is that you have the corn, you have the oil seeds and soybeans, you have the biofuels industry, but in that triangle, but within that triangle that ties it all together is livestock. And livestock can be really very fundamental to the future viability of our state's agriculture.
How does Nebraska compare, livestock growth to Iowa, Minnesota, states like that?
Well, certainly we're strong in cattle, and we probably in 5 years will be #1 in terms of cattle on feed numbers. And for obviously reasons, because of the biofuels industry and the distiller's grain as a co-product of that, and that's one plus for Nebraska. On the other livestock components, we are really losing ground relative to our neighboring states. And one good example is fed hog numbers up maybe 3% in Nebraska over the last decade, and Iowa ramped up 31%. And they are basically 8 times the volume of hog production that we are over here. And likewise in Minnesota, in South Dakota, we are seeing that in hogs. Dairy, we continue to see a decline in our dairy industry and dairy cow numbers. And at the same time, other neighboring states are far ahead of us in expanding this new scale of dairy production.
So corn would have, if you look at the 3 uses for corn, ethanol, right, exports, and then livestock, if Nebraska
Yes.
would start to increase that, the livestock on feed, that would be successful there. But I want to make sure I got a stat right today. Did you say 80% of soybean meal, Nebraska soybean meal, is pushed out of state?
As best as we can estimate at this time, yes. 75 to 80% that is produced here leaves the state as an export. A lot of it to Iowa,
Yeah.
and our neighboring states, which are ramping up the hog and the poultry for industries.
In Nebraska specifically, do you have a handle on maybe, or an initial handle, I guess I could say, on what the drought did to the livestock sector? We know there's some culling, but do you have an idea of how deep it might have went?
The livestock industry continues in the western part of the state to be hit pretty darn hard by this prevailing drought and dryness. Not nearly like what we thought at the early part of the year. We saw cattle herd numbers being culled a little stronger than usual. But unlike Texas, which is purging herds, and basically seeing a very significant decline of 15 to 20% over the last few years, we've held our own. And to the credit of the crop sector here too, we are providing forage, whether it be stock grazing after harvest or corn stover, substitute forage, and we're keeping our cattle industry here. The other sectors, I don't really see them, other than the fact that the drought shot commodity prices through the roof, and that's hard on all of our livestock sectors.
You spent some time talking today about the processing sector. Why is that important?
The processing sector is the key to value-added economic activity and a more robust local regional economy. And the more we add value through processing, the more jobs, the more income generated, the more value added, the more people that can be gainfully employed in an income pattern that keeps these rural communities going.
To close out with, you said today that we're not taking advantage of Nebraska's ag complex. Is there something that needs to be done? Is there something that should be done to move that the other way?
There certainly needs to be an awareness of how important the economics of our agricultural system is and how important livestock is to that, and the opportunities for expanding that economic viability. And when it comes down to local decisions with regards to zoning changes and potential livestock systems coming into a community, the livestock industry as well as the crops industry needs to be there to say, look folks, this is important to our local economy. It's our bread and butter in non-metro Nebraska.